Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for coming. I'm Tim Lang, covering for Net, and welcome to today's Exceptional Individuals webinar on a brief history of OCD. For those joining us for the first time today, Exceptional Individuals is a social enterprise that specializes in supporting neurodivergent individuals in the workplace and fostering inclusive working environments. So ways that we do this include workplace needs assessments, support services such as these webinars, manager training, and many other services besides. And we come from a lived strengths-based perspective, with the majority of the team being ND. And as I mentioned, a brief history of OCD. It's more about simply where did it come from and what was our understanding of it at what points in history. Are you familiar with OCD? So as I mentioned, we won't be going into great detail about all of the nuances, but there is a diagram on the right there that does give us a clue that it can be quite complicated. Okay, so a little presumably meaning that you've heard of it, and moderately presumably meaning you know some of the more common symptoms. That's a good start. Yes, so no one feels that they're experts on OCD today by the look of it, which is probably a good thing, because I'm not either, and I'll go into a little bit more detail on that shortly. But we begin. So, don't feel bad if you don't recognize this fellow. He's from a while ago. This is Saint Ignatius. Try saying that 10 times fast. He had something to say back in the day. I have thought, said, or done some other thing that comes to me from without, a thought that I have sinned. And on the other hand, it seems to me that I have not sinned. I feel some uneasiness on the subject, inasmuch as I doubt and do not doubt. So, to break it down, he's saying that he hasn't done anything intentionally to go against his faith, but somehow he feels that he has. How this relates to OCD, you ask? Well, effectively, the earliest version was regarded as a religious condition or a lack of faith. More detail to come, but that's why it's framed in this way. But we can extract from this the idea of compulsive behavior, something that we didn't necessarily intend to do or want to do, but happened. And this will be a reoccurring theme, as I'm sure you can imagine. So what words come to mind when you hear scrupulosity? If anyone else has a different way of pronouncing that, please do. However, we're going with scrupulosity. And if the answer's none, please go ahead and write that, just so that we have a handle on who's up on their scrupulosity and who isn't. Interesting. So we've got a couple. So we've got thorough and intense. So I think, oh, here we go. Morality. Okay, yeah. So basically, I think everyone's figured out that this is related to the word scrupulous, diligent, yeah, and meticulous. However, this is a cousin, let's say. Just as scrupulosity is a cousin of ADHD, scrupulosity, the word, is a cousin of scrupulous in the sense that it means something slightly different. Intense, repetitive. All right. So I'm surprised to have so much of a response, but I'm very grateful that I do. And here is a little bit of background. OCD symptoms historically referred to as scrupulosity. Early records in religious literature from the 14th and 18th centuries, which we will be covering in excruciating detail, so buckle up. So I must be honest, as scholarly as I am, I wasn't familiar with the term scrupulosity until it was brought to my attention, but I'm always happy to fill those gaps, so thank you, Nat. Scruples and scrupulous, obviously, I am aware of. And apparently I was selected for this because of my superior pronunciation. However, as I think I've just demonstrated, that was just an excuse. Medieval OCD, we have a few people who had a few things to say. So Jean Chaucer, for example, warned against excessive scrupulosity. So in translation, against religious overthinking. And going back to the previous quote, that could be taken as a doubt of faith or a lack of faith. We also have Jonas Nider, who said, in translation, consolation of a timorous conscience. So, in other words, fearful conscience. Timorous being extracted from timid, being extracted from timorous, so meaning afraid of, effectively. So again, they're talking about a lack of weakness of faith still, and as promised, that's going to be a reoccurring theme. Some people might be going, well, this isn't OCD. We have to get all the way up to modern day in order for the links to all make sense. So bear with it, and by the end, I promise it will be a full circle. Online promises, you know. All right. Who warned against negative effects? We have the answer is right there, apparently. So it was Jean Chaucer de Gerson. What's some modern equivalents of scrupulosity? So obviously we're not asking for just typing in OCD. But if anyone does have a related symptom or an even rarer condition that might, in fact, be more closely tied to the cousin, feel free to throw that in. Okay. Fear of catastrophe. Yes. So for chances are the majority of the room today are neurodivergent. So we all have a personal relationship with fear of catastrophe. Anxiety about safety. Yeah. Again, these things carry across, have a kind of a shared acuteness with most neurodivergents, but absolutely in terms of the description of scrupulosity, this is definitely a factor. Repetitive behavior. Okay, yeah. So that can be characterized separately. So that's a very good point. The issue being, as I just warned, we're still stuck very much in the religious era, meaning that everything is framed around it and defined by it. And so being able to just treat something on the basis of its symptoms wasn't really a thing yet. And so repetitive behavior being treated as simply a trait, we're too early at this time. Fear of fear of wrongdoing is probably a perfect way of briefly describing scrupulosity. Who wrote an early guide for moral OCD sufferers? So again, as you folks have all just explained, we're still stuck in the morality concept. The neurological hasn't overtaken yet. Yes, Richard Baxter, thank you. All right, so we're coming along a bit now. We're into the 17th century. So did religious views influence the understanding of OCD in the 17th century? Okay, so unsurprisingly, I think we've got an overwhelming yes. Oh, no, it's beginning to level out. And they're in the lead, and a quick turnaround, and it's going to be a photo finish. What do we have? What do we have? What do we have? Somewhere in the middle, oddly. Religious views, in fact, highly influenced the definition of anything up until around the 17th century. And then people started to slowly bring it back. But even with the religious element starting to wane slightly, we're still very much in the purely negative space. And go into more detail on that now. This is John Moore for anyone who was wondering. So now it's religious melancholy. And if you again, if you remember, the royal family were very religious at the time. I know that Queen Mary I was very, very, very Catholic, but by this point, Protestantism was also very much a thing. So melancholy, again, a word that we all know that we still use now, but was treated kind of more medically that far back. What behaviours do you associate with OCD? So where the previous question was, how do we define scrupulosity? Now we're asking specifically, what are the traits of actual obsessive-compulsive disorder? This is something that I don't have personally, but of course I can relate to certain elements. Checking locks, yes. So for example, that's an element I can relate to. I pull my door handle every time I leave the house. Long messages, all right. Anxiety, obsessive thoughts, cleaning. Yeah, so while these are a stereotype, these are also absolutely true. And those who experience ADHD probably very familiar with that fact as well. Household activity tends to be, closely tied into these types of traits. Concentration, details, reassurance seeking. Yeah, so as promised at the beginning, when you folks told me that you had a brief grasp, as promised, lo and behold, most of these would someone with OCD, I think, would probably describe as accurate. So thank you. And once again, we've got a bit of rhetoric here. So we're now moving, as I said, around the 17th century, and people had things to say. And then, of course, we jump to the 19th century. So, as a reminder, somewhere around the 14th century, purely religious. And then we get to the 17th century, where we're starting to look at it more. Religion is still, faith is still a primary factor, but we're starting to look at it as not simply being something that we're struck with from a higher or lower power, but something that simply develops. So, for example, either an active decision that we actually made or something different about us that causes that, rather than simply the devil did it or and so on. However, it's not until the 19th century where we're starting to go, all right, this is definitely something specifically within the mental sphere. This is neurological for sure. And so it's at this point that we started to identify and categorize the symptoms and traits that you all just shared with me. And of course, we got Freud there just to be safe. Once again, people had things to say. So but as promised, not very pleasant in terms of how it was considered. So folly, impulsive, in translation, mental illness, madness, insanity, unwise behavior. It is identifying properly the compulsive element as being an element, not, so it's no longer religious compulsion or lack of faith, it's just compulsion, but they've also thrown madness in there as well. So not ideal. So basically, if you had OCD at that point and someone diagnosed you, you could go, oh, great, I'm not a sinner, but apparently I'm mad. Not ideal, as I said. Similarly, we've got someone else who wanted to use folly as well, Jean-Pierre this time, which translates to madness of doubt. So again, you can argue over how medically accurate or relevant this is, but nonetheless, although we're now narrowing things down, it's not necessarily a benefit to have the diagnosis at this time. Cheat sheet aside, how did Jean-Pierre describe OCD? Okay, so apparently, yes. Just as a reminder to everyone, they both used the term folly, but only one of them used that full title. And there's your proof. But thank you for playing nonetheless. One person did apparently remember with, oh no, two, one posthumous, but hey, why not? Oh yeah, and so a point about these pictures, who are all these random folks, they're often the same person as we cross, just from different periods of their life cycle. Do you think categorizing OCD as a degenerative disorder increased or decreased the stigma? Okay, so it looks like a solid increase. Yes, I would agree with this. So basically, by saying, so to clarify, degenerative, something that gets worse over time, and something that makes you worse than you already were. So yes, that would not make it a very pleasant sounding thing. To clarify stigma, the idea of something being wrong or bad, whether it's subconscious or otherwise, without that necessarily being the case. And so, yes, I would say that the idea that this is something that makes you worse and gets worse as it goes automatically puts it in a bad light. But then on top of that, if you're calling it madness of doubt, you probably don't want to invite someone with madness of doubt to your dinner parties either. 20th century, as promised. As I said, a lot of these old geezers look alike, so apologies for the slip up earlier. But now we have Freud. Okay, Sigmund Freud, just to clarify. So OCD was now defined as defense against hidden conflicts. So again, this is interesting because it's far more behavioral than the earlier definitions. Now, of course, a lot of Freud's work isn't used any longer. However, there's no disputing how influential him and his peers were for the time. And we also have Pierre Janet, guessing at the pronunciation, shocker, separated OCD from pain, linked to physical tension. Interestingly, sorry, physiological tension. Interestingly, they define it as a lack of tension. So again, using ADHD as the spotlight, someone might resonate and go, yeah, too much tension causes a negative outcome. But it's defined here, in fact, of less tension causes that lack of focus or raise in compulsion. All right, so who proposed that OCD arises from insufficient physiological tension? See, already someone's fallen for the trap. Thank you, whoever came second. The Freud was the picture, but I was very much describing the more French-sounding name when I spoke of tension. But well done to the majority for letting the first person fall on their sword before you moved. All right. How would you think Freud's theories on OCD influenced modern physiological treatments? Yes, good point. So as we said, not everything that Freud was into has been carried across into modern day, but psychopathy is still very much around and was very much his remit at the time. So that would have certainly been the approach. But one of the important things here is treatment. In the 19th, 20th century, the concept of treatment became broader. Everyone knows the stereotype of Chuck Leech's at it being the favorite approach right up to the 17th century. Consider the positives of the OCD condition. Yes. So as we mentioned briefly, we started to properly identify things, and as a consequence of that, we started to separate things. So this belongs in that category, that belongs in that category. Hence that wheel of subtypes that we had up earlier in one of the first slides. And yes, very much an influence to modern day, even though we've refined things a bit more in terms of what's physiological and what's psychological. As promised, we categorized things, as you can see. So now we have an example of a model here that separates it into 4: obsessions, anxiety, compulsions, and relief. So relief referring to periods where the traits are less, and therefore people might feel more capable or more normal. Okay, so on to the actual question at hand. Do current models provide a better understanding of OCD compared to earlier theories? Interestingly, we seem tied again. It's a very tug-of-war group today, which is ideal. But yes, the yeses just have it. And I would concur with that notion. Compared to going back to our identified cousin way back around the 14th century, firstly, it was again considered religious, and secondly, I don't think there was much consideration in the way of treatment, at least not in terms of for the benefit of the person, the individual. Whereas right through up to the 20th century, now we're doing a bit of everything. We're categorising things. We're figuring out we're treating people as people somewhat, and we're also considering what would treat them. And so that definitely all carried across, even though we might be a bit more medically minded now, but also that care of the individual and that connection to mental health very much more present now than it was, but probably came from this period. All right, so what historical figures with OCD have you heard of? So obviously some of these diagnoses are going to be a bit apocryphal or a bit posthumous, but nonetheless, basically, if you've heard of this person, go ahead and give it a click. So we've got the OG Martin Luther rather than King or Junior. As a reminder, Martin Luther was a German priest who had things to say. Famously, he felt that religion as an institution was corrupt and therefore held a protest, which people still talk about to this day. As for the others, John Byron, English Christian writer, Samuel Johnson, Anglican poet and moralist, Charles Darwin, of course, naturalist, biologist, and made great contributions to the understanding of evolution. Nikola Tesla, engineer, inventor, Howard Hughes, aerospace engineer, business icon, and sometimes filmmaker, and Katharine Hepburn, actor and perhaps activist. All right, so, poor John Byron being the only one. Sorry, Bunyan, my bad. Probably explains why. But nonetheless, as homework, everyone feel free to look up Bunyan later. All right, so which historical figures OCD influenced their work the most? So let's rephrase that. OCD influenced which historical figures the most? Yes, I would definitely argue that Darwin probably had the least to do with it. And yes, in the case of Martin Luther, although scrupulosity was something that, he's basically is in the right time, still very religious oriented. So definitely Tesla, in the sense that they are thinking about it in those less religious terms by that point. Also, just before we move on, another thing to bear in mind is that these days is a very different quote unquote kettle of fish, because not only are we considering the individual, not only are we separating physiological and psychological and so on, but we're also on a more social community level making attempts to make things inclusive as well. So inclusive language is something that we've established very much didn't exist back then. Folly this and folly that, for example. So to the point where someone might describe themselves as having OCC these days. So that's obsessive compulsive condition. So it still explains what the main traits are, but doesn't speak of it as a disorder, implying that there's something that they're broken or substandard in some. In fact, I have a great graphic for that, which I think I may have skipped earlier. Here we go. So if you look at this gentleman on the right, he doesn't look happy. And so the implication of the image is that because there's something inside of him that's wrong. So jump back to modern day, we very strongly advise against the notion that having atypical behaviours is in any way, shape, or form automatically wrong or makes us broken or deficient. And therefore, some of the anxiety and depression and worse that everyone up to now would have faced is even more severe than what we experience. Just a side note, imagine the idea of, for whatever reason, sleeping in and skipping church 500 years ago. Not only the behavior of other people, but the way that you would be compelled to feel as well. And then bring that to now and consider how much easier we have it. All right, rant over. So, what is the most surprising thing you've learned about OCD so far today? And it can focus on one of the historical characters rather than the condition. After all, this is the brief history of. But nonetheless, I'd like to hear from you. Someone asked if it was of Loyola. The answer is yes. Apparently someone is happy to have me, always appreciated. All right, I'll come back to that momentarily. Regarding what is the most surprising thing? We've got scrupulosity. Yes, as I said, that was new on me at some point. Let's take a moment to consider how else we might pronounce that. Scrupulosity? Scrupulosity? Religious origins, yep. Again, new one on me. To be fair, if you go far back enough, most things either were of religious origins or usurped by religion. However, nonetheless, that's certainly not the first thing I thought of when I hear OCD up until a week ago. Either there's a letter missing or I've just been introduced to a new word. Prevalence in the past. And not feeling too guilty. Ah, that's a lovely sentiment to add in. Yes, absolutely. So the thing about being different in any way, shape, or form is we feel compelled to feel a certain. If someone says, you know, why did you do it that way, or that's wrong, or anything that implies that we've stepped out of place or we're not capable of achieving something in the appropriate manner, feelings tend to come in, whether it's an overabundance or not. And so, again, important thing about the modern day compared to any previous period is that we have the opportunity to express our feelings and we have the opportunity to some degree to choose how we want to feel about something. All right, so back to the chat. Religious views definitely influenced everything back then because people were looking for direction. Yes, absolutely. But at the same time, I'm sure some people would have been happily left alone, but didn't have a choice in the matter. And that effectively could be a good alternative definition for scrupulosity. Because again, it's in the sense that doubt was one of the primary focuses. So yes, if you had OCD, you would be doing things against, you know, your will and therefore by extension perhaps against the religious rule. But also, of course, there would have been a lot of people that doubted their faith simply because it's not something that they instinctively trusted or believed in. Howard Hughes, yeah. He would have appeared in several, not his own pictures, but he would have had several biopics by now. And yes, DiCaprio did portray him at some point. So let's do wrap up and then questions. So workplace needs assessments for anyone who hasn't heard of this previously. This is a way that your employer can support you by allowing you to receive a report of how your conditions affect your work and what might help moving forward with them. And so that can act as a kind of roadmap moving forward so that everyone has a more level understanding of the individual's circumstances. And that's something, of course, exceptional individuals can support with if relevant. So I like to think that this is a artificial intelligence render of Nat. Can't say that for a fact, but this in theory is the next upcoming. And hopefully you will have Nat Classic for that one. So that's social anxiety disorder. do I have? Feel free to subscribe if you're not already, so that you get those warnings about what the weekly session will be, contact details if required. And yeah, let's get into questions. So obviously I've answered a few that came through the chat earlier on. So someone asked regarding childhood OCD. So there is a lot of information available on online. I can't speak of it personally, but hopefully someone does have something to suggest. And if not, feel free to email us, admin at would work, for example, and certainly we'll have some sort of third-party resource that will be relevant. Wasn't today's topic, but in terms of what OCD is, so how it's separated from other neurodivergent conditions. So obsessive and compulsive are obviously the archetypal traits. So obsession referring to being very interested or into one specific thing, and compulsive being the need to do it. But of course, there's much more to it besides. But also it's regarded on the mental health side as being something that can, somewhat be managed depending on what our environment is and how we're feeling, as opposed to some of the purely neurodivergent traits that might be more acutely aware of or sensitive to, say, anxiety or depression, but it isn't an automatic factor. Whereas in OCD, I think it kind of has one foot in either world. Hopefully that confused you less, not more. Fingers crossed. But like I said, more details on our website, and also feel free to get in touch. All right. So anyone else before we close up?
Can I just ask something, Tim?
By all means.
Yeah, very interesting. Thank you. I don't know why I haven't ever linked OCD and neurodiversity. So I've been wondering about eating disorders as well. But did you say anything about perfectionism?
I didn't, but yes, that falls again into both obsessive and compulsive. So anyone with neurodivergence, particularly I'd argue, let's say ADHD or ASD, knows of perfectionism, and that can manifest in various ways, including not wanting to let something go because it's not good enough, or or not wanting to show someone something in the first place, not wanting to include people on the basis that it isn't 100%, or simply feeling that everything has to be really big or really grand, when in reality a kind of simpler version would not only do, but perhaps be preferred because it would be faster, cheaper, whatever, right? However, in the case of OCD, that's definitely part of a lot of those subgroups that were identified. Because again, as the word compulsion means that we don't have a choice. It's something that just happens, right?
Mm.
And so perfectionism can manifest as a compulsion.
Makes sense.
And so there is a link, and you can have both. And in terms of, as I said, is OCD neurodivergence? One foot in either world, because it's definitely neurological, as we've established. So
Mm.
it already has that tick in the box, but also some of the symptoms, such as perfectionism, as you just mentioned, cross several of the conditions. And so again, there's definitely a connection there too. So thank you for bringing that up. Hopefully that answers your question.
Yes, thank you. Yeah.
All right, I guess we're done for the day. So thank you everyone for attending. If it was your first time, these are weekly, so please do show up to the same Nat show, same Nat channel next week. And I wish everyone a pleasant Thursday. Ta-ra, ta-ra.